In January of 1692, in the town of Salem, Massachusetts, 11-year-old Abigail Williams and her cousin, 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris, began exhibiting strange behaviour. They were having convulsions, screaming fits, and were talking in ways that were unfamiliar to their families. A doctor was called, as was a priest, and it was determined that these girls were bewitched or under an evil hand. They encouraged the children to name the witch that cursed them. They named Tituba, the family's enslaved servant, a poor woman, Sarah Good, and an old widow named Sarah Osborne. Later, another young girl called Anne Putman also started displaying these symptoms, and eventually 12 girls in total in the village of Salem were affected. Suspicion spread, as did the accusations. The Salem witch trials took place between February 1692 and May of 1693. Over 100 people were imprisoned. 30 people were found guilty of witchcraft. 19 were executed. 14 women and 5 men, and it is said that a further 13 may have died in prison. All it took was 2 young girls displaying unusual behaviour and their word against 3 older women. Today I want to go over what caused the Salem witch trials, and I want to be clear, I'm talking specifically about the trials in Salem in the 1690s and not the European witch trials, because they would certainly deserve a whole other video. I want to delve into what caused this particular situation at this particular time, but that does lead us on to my first point. Hysteria. The European witch trials certainly inspired some of the hysteria that led to the Salem outbreak. The trend of accusing and executing witches had spread through Europe in the previous century. Well, guess where many Europeans immigrated to in the decades afterwards? The newly settled colonies of America. It is no doubt that many of the original settlers to America knew exactly what was going on across Europe, and may have even immigrated to escape the fear of the very idea of witches. It wasn't a weird thing to believe in witches or witchcraft back then, and in fact many were deadly afraid of the very thought of an unseen magic and a dark energy and communing with the devil. Do you have anything that you're deathly afraid of for really no logical reason, like aliens or ghosts or clowns that hide in sewers? Then it's not a far jump to understand that these people were scared of something that they grew up believing was real. And this brings me to the next cause, religion. Salem was settled by Puritans in the early 1600s to ensure their religious freedom. They practiced very strict religious rules and beliefs that were woven into the very workings of society, especially the legal system. At the beginning of the witch trials, evidence could count as anything. Visions, voices, birthmarks, or the proof of the devil's hand could easily be used to convict an accused witch. So the supernatural was taken as fact. Puritan communities too were built on the teachings of the church, and they were highly educated on the devil, the way the devil would act, and how they could find marks of the devil. In fact, they knew exactly what they needed to in order to prepare for these trials. Puritan children also had a fear of the devil drilled into them from birth. The teaching was focused on scaring the children against all things sinful and dark, with severe threats if they ever found themselves unfaithful to God. So picture all these children deathly scared of the devil's work, growing up and having power over a whole society of other scared adults and children. All this being said, they also believed that witchcraft and dark magic existed. It wasn't that hard for them to believe that their neighbours were witches, and all of their bad luck was just down to dark magic. Tied together, everyone was deathly afraid of everything, and with this threat of witchcraft, were feeling especially vulnerable. And what about political power? A special court was created to hold the accused to trial, and guess who was in charge of these trials? A lot of politically and religiously powerful men in Massachusetts, people who wanted to retain that power and fear in Puritan society. As I said, Puritans were taught to fear the devil, and if the devil was amongst them, they had to get rid of the threat. But it also meant that it offered a great way to reinstate the fear and control that the strict society had over its followers. The girls initially inflicted were actually the daughter and the niece of Samuel Parris, the Reverend of Salem, a powerful and important person back then. He was actually experiencing waning support just 3 months before his own household is struck by witchcraft. And so Reverend Parris himself may have somehow organised the whole thing in order to create some power and control over the village through fear. Anyone who spoke out against the accusations or attempt to protect accused witches, such as John Proctor, who protested against the examination of his wife Elizabeth for witch marks, and was promptly imprisoned himself. Other ministers and judges that were questioning the ways of the court found themselves or their own wives being accused or under suspicion. So not only did many people want to jump onto the hysteria bandwagon, but if you questioned what was going on, you would be at the mercy of being called about next. And this brings us to political and economic prejudices. Many of the initially accused were people who were going against the grain of normal life. The very first 3 women who were accused were somewhat outsiders to society, reclusive and outcast from the church. This meant that they were outliers and problems for the strong sense of unity in the Puritan village. Now, this isn't the case as more and more women got accused, but it's interesting that the first 3 suspects were people who had no power to stand up for themselves and would be pretty easy targets. Economic distribution also may have played its own part. We are able to look back on these events now and see certain patterns emerging. Salem was split into 2 sections, Salem Town, which was a wealthy merchant town, and Salem Village, which was mostly farmers and poorer households. Accusers more often came from the poorer village, and those accused were more likely to be from the town. This pattern may be revealing that this event harboured more disagreements between neighbours and less about actual suspicions of the devil's work. And some women accused happened to have been quite wealthy. Some were widows and owned their own land. This may not be a direct cause, but it is something to consider. Now let's consider sexism. Witch trials across the world were a pretty misogynistic trope of men accusing women of being too masculine, and therefore they were the devil. And usually, in the case of Salem, all the accusers were women between the ages of 9 and 20 years old. And most of the accused were mostly women ages 40 to 60 years old. It is speculated that perhaps these younger women were jealous or intimidated of these older women who had gotten themselves out of the thumb of the strict Puritan ideals. Widows and spinsters were almost always outside of the realm of societal norms and the patriarchal Puritan society. They had more ability for freedom and could cause disruption and disorder to the ways of doing things. So this finger pointing may have also just been about those who fit into the norms and those who don't. And were these accusations simply scapegoats? The winter of 1691, the year previous, was terrible, causing economic hardships for all. People were suffering and were miserable, and probably desperate for some reason to explain their situation. We've seen this time and time again with any prejudice mixed with hardship. People needed someone to blame. So once someone points the finger, perhaps it was easier to jump on board than to admit that it may have just been a natural explanation for their crop failures, not the devil cursing their harvest. But most importantly, never underestimate the power of accusing someone before someone else has the chance to accuse you. If you side with the good guys, you're less likely to be singled out as a bad guy. Now, we can't rule out boredom or teen rebellion, which is perhaps the most unnerving suggestion, is that these young girls were just bored. Again, Puritan society was strict, and children didn't really have much to entertain them. Though their story seems more powerful the more girls that became afflicted, their symptoms became very suspiciously inconsistent, and often followed the example of only 1 or 2 girls. Some have suggested that perhaps they just came up with a sort of game to play and enjoyed the attention and power this game gave them. In fact, one man, Daniel Elliott, testified that one of the girls had told him that she did it for sport, and another said that she accused her own grandfather from her own wickedness. Puritans were taught against aggression and violence, and really any visual display of intense emotions. Teenage girls are a ball of emotion and probably felt extremely suffocated in this restricted society. And because of this, projection is also considered a real reason why these girls may have just taken it out on everybody else. Now, there is a scientific reason: poison. It was just 2 girls who first exhibited signs of bewitchment, but in fact scientists today believe that they may have been poisoned, even accidentally. A common thought is that they were afflicted by ergot on rye, a fungus that may have developed on their bread, and that may have caused these episodes. But it's uncertain why only a few adolescent girls were infected and not the whole village. Be it an outbreak or hallucinations, I think regardless of what happened to these girls, if it was a physical ailment or just made up, everyone believed them. And it isn't a major hysteria until people actually get arrested and die just from what these girls said. So really there is no specific answer. Why did Salem get enveloped in mass witch hysteria? Well, they did because of numerous elements and factors that created Salem as it existed in 1692, and there is no one reason that we can point to or no one person to blame. Let's consider the example if today 2 young girls randomly started acting strangely. Today we would take them to the doctor, consider tests and scientific evidence. We'd even take them to therapy. If they accused your maid or your neighbour of having poisoned them, you'd likely just ask why, or go and talk to your neighbour or gather concrete evidence if you suspected anything. Kids today wouldn't also be as educated on ways of the devil, so it would be kind of weird if they started accusing the devil's work. Justice systems today have an innocent until proven guilty philosophy, so this accusation wouldn't really go very far at all. On top of this, we also don't live in a very close-knit villages anymore, so I couldn't tell you what my neighbour does in their own privacy or what religious commandments they are going against. Long story short, a situation that took place 200 years ago was very specific to that particular period and location, and all the other elements that I touched on. And that's what makes history so interesting. Unique events like this pop up all the time, and there are so many angles to study it from. Now, thanks for sticking around for this deep dive into the Salem witch trials. I hope everyone has a very happy, spooky, and safe Halloween. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.